Sounds like you're coming through loud and clear.
No worries.
So I just want to welcome Dr. Graham Oppy, Professor of Philosophy at Monash University in Melbourne, Australia. Very well known. I don't think you need much introduction, but if you wanted to give a little bit more of an introduction on yourself, you're welcome to.
So I guess not really. If you really think that people know who I am, then it's fine. We can just get started.
Okay. All right. No worries. So yeah, I have some general questions maybe to start out with, and I know some people have like some more technical questions that they're interested in getting your feedback on maybe later. I mean, one thing that I've always found very interesting in your work is the discussions on the PSR that you've gone back and forth with Alexander Pruss and Kuhns on over the years. I'm just wondering where you think that discussion currently stands. If there's any weak versions of the PSR that you accept, or
so I think that if you want to, you can accept a relatively strong version of the PSR. It depends a little bit where you want to go on the question about indeterministic causation. So if you think that there's some tension between the PSR and having indeterministic causes, then your principle's going to be fairly weak if it turns out, as I suspect it does, that quantum mechanics requires indeterministic causation. Similarly, if you happen to be someone who believes in libertarian freedom, again, there's going to be some trickiness reconciling that with the principle of sufficient reason, with a strong version of the principle of sufficient reason. So what I've got in mind, if you've got either of those things, if you've got quantum indeterminacy or you've got libertarian freedom, there'll be contrastive things that you can't explain. So suppose that it's a kind of choice of two things. Either thing could have happened, A or B. So A actually happens, but it equally could have been B. Then there's nothing that explains why the world as it was led to the one thing, to A rather than to B. And that, for some people, like for Leibniz, that would have been a violation of his principle of sufficient reason. Recent defenders of sufficient reason, like Pruss and Kuhns, seem to think that it's quite consistent with their versions of sufficient reason that you have these indeterministic things, and that and that it's kind of consistent with sufficient reason, that there's no explaining why the world generated the one thing rather than the other, or in the normal case, it'll be one amongst a huge range of alternatives. Is that enough?
Yeah, no, definitely.
Yeah.
I think that answered that question pretty well. I've always found that topic very interesting. I like to play around with those ideas too. I wrote an argument myself recently about it that is probably terrible, but so another question I wanted to ask you, just as an atheist going through philosophy of religion departments and things like this, have you noticed, has it been a different experience for you than maybe you think other people have had, like theists who study philosophy of religion? Like, would you characterize it as a different sort of experience for an atheist?
So that's a really hard question to answer, because most of my experience has been in Australia rather than in North America, in particular in the United States. And my experience in the United States, I was at a school in which actually there was no philosophy of religion taught, and at the time there were no people there, except maybe Mark Johnson. There was really nobody there who was interested in philosophy of religion. So I think that there are differences in the kind of way in which philosophy of religion is represented in philosophy departments in Australia compared to the United States. There are very few philosophers of religion, full stop, in Australia. I could probably count them on fingers of one hand, people who actually are actively engaged, at least until recently. Whereas you have big programs in the United States where there are lots of philosophers of religion, And in particular, you have programs where there are decent numbers of theists, particularly Christian theists. So I think that my experience may be quite different, but not in ways that have had any particular impact on me.
Fair enough. Yeah. Would you say that overall is Australia on the whole a little bit more secularized, and that could explain that, or do you think is that kind of going too far?
So that would be part of it. Part of it is that we have very few private universities, and part of it is that the next census results, when they come out, will probably show that about half the population is ticking the no religion box, which is a higher proportion than you get in the United States.
Interesting. So I also wanted to ask a pretty general question on the topic of philosophy or religion. Do you think that there are any big ideas or extremely important arguments that maybe have sort of cross-disciplinary appeal, or even just taken on its own, that are like the big ideas of philosophy or religion for you?
And that's a really hard question to answer. I guess when I started out doing philosophy of religion, really the focus in the classes that I attended and in my reading was on arguments for and against the existence of God, and secondarily on divine attributes. And it was a discussion mostly amongst people from different kinds of Christian backgrounds. So Protestants and Catholics, people who are more or less liberal, and so on. I think that the discussion has broadened over time in certain respects, though the focus of discussion at least in kind of North American circles, is still pretty much on issues to do with Christianity, but it's kind of broadened out beyond attributes and the arguments about existence to a wider range of issues. I've got interested recently in questions about the history of atheism and free thought, and I can see that there's lots of interesting work to be done there. Some of it's historical, but some of it's philosophical as well. That's not, I think, a direction that the discipline as a whole is going in, but it's the direction that my interests have been going in over the last 4 or 5 years.
Okay. Yeah, I'm sorry. I know that was a very, very broad question. So another thing I wanted to ask about, I guess you were talking about the differences between, different varieties of Christianity. I think it was this past week that there was a debate between White and William Lane Craig on Molinism versus Calvinism. I don't know if you have any thoughts with that, or if you have, specific views about free will, or how you think it plays into that debate.
Okay, so I didn't tune into that debate, but I've been seeing kind of feedback about it, both on Twitter and on Facebook, so I know it must have been a significant event. So I've written a little bit about Molinism from a kind of critical perspective. I worry that the Molinist position is kind of deeply unstable, because the way that, for example, Plantinga presents it, you have these counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, which God takes into account in creating the world, which means that the truth of those things is causally upstream from what happens when people are making decisions. But if you then think about their decision context, part of what's in the context is that there's a causal history that goes back to God's making things in part because in these circumstances they're going to act a certain way. That means that in the circumstances there's nothing else they can do, so they don't have libertarian freedom. The thing looks kind of inconsistent to me. So that's one thing about that dispute. The other thing is that I'm quite happy to go not to be a libertarian about freedom, so I'm quite happy to be a compatibilist. So I think that the kind of issue about determinism versus indeterminism is sort of neither here nor there from the standpoint of freedom, even though I also happen to think that the world's probably indeterministic.
Interesting. Yeah, that's yeah. I have some odd views about determinism and free. I tend to consider myself a compatibilist as well. So, yeah, and I guess a couple more broad questions. So, in my experience with discussions about God, the existence of God, or philosophy of religion questions, a lot of the times people will invoke like skeptical objections. I mean, it seems to me that skeptical objections sort of apply roughly across the board to sort of everybody, but they seem to get used in these debates a lot. I don't know if you have any views on skepticism in general, or in skeptical objections in general. I was also going to ask about, I know you did some philosophy of language work, and I didn't know if you had any views on like, the Kripke-Wittgenstein sort of objections, skeptical objections to like meaning, or if you think that these sort of things again are just like, hard questions that apply to everybody, or.
Okay, so I think that what you're kind of suggesting in your comments is right, that if you're going to take skepticism about one or another kind of thing, meaning or other mind or the external world seriously, it's going to apply to everybody equally. I'm not inclined towards skepticism about any of those things myself, and so I'm not thinking that I would want to bring them into the conversation about the existence of God, because they just seem kind of irrelevant to that discussion. Once you bring in those considerations, they're going to help or hinder both sides equally.
Awesome. All right. Yeah. And then I guess I know some other people are going to end up asking you some questions just relating to logic, and ideas of consistency and things like this. And I guess it would go to those skeptical objections too, like things like the Munchausen's trilemma. Would you say that when you talk about like worldview analysis, or like theoretical virtue considerations, that like that's where you think the conversation belongs, as opposed to questioning whether or not any of us are ultimately justified, sort of thing?
So I guess that sounds right too. I'm not interested in kind of handing out ribbons to the people who are rational and brickbats to the ones that are not. I mean, I think that the question isn't really, the interesting questions are not about who you can accuse of irrationality. Interesting questions are the ones that you referred to, where you just sort of take seriously all of the competing positions, and then try to find some relatively neutral way of trying to work out which ones are doing better and which ones are doing worse. I think that overall, actually carrying out any program like that's rather difficult, and I'm quite happy to end up in a position which is somewhere that I end up in most of the things that I write, where I say, look, there are questions for judgment here, and reasonable people can go different ways on it. From my point of view, when I do these evaluations, it seems to me that there's a kind of naturalism that's just kind of clearly the best place to go. But I know that there are lots of smart people who disagree with that, and I'm not going to start calling them names just because they disagree with me.
Perfect. Yeah, no, I really respect that. I think that that's what generates the best discussions also. Let's see, we just got a question that popped in here. Do you have a position on Frege versus Millionism with respect to proper names?
Okay, so As it happens, that was the topic of my PhD dissertation. Um, so we have this. I mean, just background in case there are some people here sure about the background to this. The Millian view is roughly that the semantic content of a name is just the object named, whereas the Frege view, very roughly, is that there are two components to semantic content, perhaps the most important of which is called sense and is variously interpreted, but you might think of it as something like a mode of presentation of an object, and then the other component is the object. So the two views agree that the kind of objects are part of the semantic content, but the Fregean view also has modes of presentation in it, the Russellian view doesn't. There's been this very long, it feels like very long dispute, though I guess it's kind of maybe not so hot now as it was 40 years ago. What I did in my dissertation was to argue against the kinds of views that people like Scott Soames and Nathan Selman were running at the time, defending the Russellian theory and arguing that there was no advantage that their views had over the Fregean theories. So in generally, and I developed a kind of Fregean theory that I thought could fit the data as well as any Russellian theory could. And I haven't really been back to think about that stuff since the mid-90s, but I guess my position is still a kind of Fregean view.
Okay. And then I guess related to naturalism too, the idea of like the Humean versus non-Humean about like physical laws or about natural laws. I would imagine that you're sort of like non-Humean about them.
So there's lots of topics on which I'm more or less agnostic. And if you force me to give an answer, I'm going to go something non-Humean, but something like thinking in terms of powers. But I'm not sure. So there's another part of me that wants to be as much of a nominalist as it's possible to be. And so I would like to think that in the end, I'm not really going to be committed to properties. And that probably means that in the end, I don't really want to be committed to powers either. Okay, so as you can see, there's a kind of lack of decision there. I don't really have a particular view that I'm wedded to on either of those, on any of that kind of broad range of metaphysical questions.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. And then I have one other quick like softball question for you, I guess, before we open up the floor a little bit. And we'll restrict it to like one at a time, just so it doesn't get out of hand. Do you have a favorite paper of yours that you've written? I don't know if it's similar to like artwork where you kind of become critical of yourself after you publish a paper, or if you have any papers you've written that you think are really like the cream of the crop, basically.
So papers, I don't know. I kind of like the book I wrote, the Atheism, the Basics, which I hope is a reasonably accessible introduction to philosophical and broader discussion about atheism. Of the things that I've written, probably that's the one that I like the most. It also happens to be fairly recent, and there is this kind of recency effect. The longer it is since you wrote something, the more problems you can see with it.
Yeah, and I can imagine that comes along with getting a little bit more knowledgeable or wise as the years go on too. Yeah, I tend to look back at my younger self as being.
Yeah. So there's that, but there's also, I think, that maybe you get a bit more critical of writing and maybe try to work a bit harder at writing in a way that a broader range of people will be able to understand what you're saying. When I started out, I was really focused on debates with particular people, and I just took for granted that they were their head was full of similar thoughts to mine, and so that I could speak quite directly to them, writing in a language that actually is not that easy for lots of other people to break into. So I've tried to improve my writing over time to make it more accessible to a wider range of people.
Definitely. All right. I think we'll try to see if anybody wants to raise their hand. Yeah, Detroiter, I'll bring you up. So we'll get a question from Detroiter here.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Hi, Dr. Oppy. Thanks so much for doing this. I had a question about fine tuning, and I think one in the best argument against God is, roughly speaking, that whatever designer hypothesis we might have, there is a designer which exists with some likelihood, and with some likelihood creates a life-permitting universe. We can construct an atheistic hypothesis at least as plausible, which predicts a life-permitting universe with equal likelihood. And I was thinking that, well, even if this is so, where does the Bayesian fine-tuning argument go wrong? And my thought is that it's in the constraint on the priors. So, when we're comparing a specific designer hypothesis with a very general atheistic one, the priors on the designer hypothesis should actually be so much smaller than the general atheistic one, such that the conclusion doesn't follow. But I was wondering what you think. Do you see what I'm getting at here?
No, I think that's exactly right. I think that you need to it's very important when if you're in the business of making Bayesian arguments, it's very important that the hypotheses that you're comparing are properly matched to one another. If you've got one very specific hypothesis and one very general hypothesis, and you're not comparing like with like, and the result that you end up with is not of any interest to anyone. So, yeah, I just accept what you said.
Yeah, fair enough. Thanks.
All right. If anybody else would like to ask a question, feel free to. Okay. Yep. Euler. Let's see.
I think Axiom had their hands raised first, but.
Oh, okay. Oh, I'm having a. Oh, it's my mouse. Okay. Like something's not working here.
I got it.
Okay. Oops. I moved him back.
Okay.
Okay. We can't hear you.
Okay. Oh. Hopefully I fixed everything up, so that way there's no interaction from anything in the background. Can you guys hear me perfectly fine?
Yep.
So, Oppy, I have studied a good bit of philosophy and religion over the last year and pretty much my entire life. Are you familiar with Sigmund Freud's work?
I've read The Future of an Illusion. I've read long time ago The Interpretation of Dreams. What else have I read? Not much else. I mean, the thing that's most of interest to philosophy of religion, I think, is The Future of an Illusion. People in philosophy of religion have typically read that.
He also wrote a interesting hypothesis about how Moses was actually an ancient Egyptian priest. This is just a hypothesis, of course. An ancient Egyptian priest of Aten, the god that was well attributed to Akhenaten. 1 second, be right back.
All right. Yeah, we might want to get Euler in here really quick while Axiom figures out what he's got going on.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh man, I'm having technical difficulties.
It's okay. Just tell me who you want to accept them. Do it. What's up, Euler? All right. Here, let's try it again.
I am so sorry about that.
Oh, okay. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. Euler, 1 moment.
Okay, I'll just mute.
I am so sorry about that. Got a little busy at work. Was not expecting that. But he pretty much made a compelling link to a priest saying that one of Akhenaten's priests was just essentially Moses. I highly recommend it. It's pretty good for a philosophical. It's a pretty good hypothesis.
Is there a question there?
Yeah.
I just wanted to know what your opinion was on it, Oppy.
So I've read a little bit about the history of religion in the Mediterranean. There's a very nice 2-volume work that Oxford put out, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 years ago now, tracing the development of religion around the Mediterranean up until, so from the kind of the very early Sumerian, Babylonian and so on times right through until just before the rise of Islam. And that's it. That's about all I know about ancient philosophy of religion. So I'm not familiar with Freud's discussion, and I just don't have a view.
Okay, that was my question. I appreciate it.
All right. Thank you, Axiom. Euler, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Okay, so I want to ask about infinite regressions. So I think I remember hearing you in the video with Dr. Andrew Loke that you said that you thought the universe has like a necessary beginning. So if you had to commit to a position, whether it was like had a necessary beginning, an infinite regression, cyclic or whatnot, which way do you lean? And can you give like an intuition pump behind it as to why you lean that way?
Okay, so I can't now remember the details of the discussion with Loke, but what I imagine that I would have said is that, strictly speaking, I'm just agnostic between the options here. So I don't see anything that kind of definitively goes one way or another. And in part, it really depends. I mean, where I'm going to lean depends upon where the physics currently suggests you should lean. So if you think that there's a multiverse, you're probably going to end up going for infinite regress. Whoa, what happened?
You okay?
Oh, is there a technical glitch?
Yeah, okay, sorry. Everything went dark at my end. It's okay, it'll come back, I think. That's really weird. Anyway, I'm still connected. Why did it log me out?
Yeah, there are a lot of glitches with these stages on Discord. It's sort of like a new feature that's still being developed. So sometimes there's.
Oh, I just had to log back in, which I don't understand why we were still connected. But anyway, that's fine. Yeah. So it could turn out that the best view is going to be infinite regress. It seems to be an open question. But but my main thought is it doesn't matter which way we go. Naturalism is going to look better whichever way we go. And I spent a lot of time thinking about the necessary origins view, because lots of people who go for theism have a necessary origins kind of view. They at least think that there's some necessary thing that stands, that's at the beginning that produces the universe, and so on. So whether in the so I want to say two things. I'm just agnostic about this issue, but I'm quite happy to think about the development in detail of a naturalistic view that starts with a necessary beginning, supposes that there's an initial singularity and that every possible world starts from that same singularity. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and then I've got one little side question from that, and I'll leave it here.
Yeah, sure.
See, I've been thinking where to sort of put my chips myself on this problem, and I kind of lean more to the infinite regression. But a part of me wants to say that the reason, like that, the question itself might not be well posed. That when we're talking about causality and like contingency, it doesn't really like scale out to the size of the universe. Is this a sentiment that's out there and has opinions on?
Okay, so that's interesting. I've thought that for quite a while that maybe time doesn't scale out in the sense that you're talking about, so that it's possible that sort of in some sense around the edges reality is not temporal. I hadn't thought that maybe it's not causal. I guess because I'm inclined to the view that sort of what holds everything together is causation. I'm inclined to think of causation as fundamental, more fundamental than space-time. But maybe that's wrong.
Okay,
sorry, yeah?
That's an interesting answer. I appreciate your time. Thanks.
As a side question from that, also, just do you have you spent any time looking at Everettian quantum mechanics, which is the many worlds interpretation?
I should have spent more time looking at what L. Wilson says in his work on the Everettian interpretation. Al was a colleague of mine for a while, and we talked about things, and we discovered that we kind of both had an interest in this idea that maybe there's a kind of necessary beginning, and that sort of all the possible worlds diverge from the same beginning. It's just that he frames his view in the context of Everettian QM, whereas mine is a kind of more philosophical conception. I don't really want to commit myself to any particular interpretation of quantum mechanics. That just seems too much up in the air at the moment, and anyway is way beyond my competence to decide.
Totally respectable. Yeah, I like many worlds, but it's probably because I spend too much time listening to Sean Carroll, who's fascinating, and I always thought that idea was outlandish until I really heard him delve into it, and it made more sense as I listened to him. But yeah, does anybody else in the audience have a question? Feel free to raise your hand. Yeah, I'm not seeing anybody at the moment. So yeah, maybe we could go into the.
Yeah, but say now's a good time to start seeing if we have any text questions while people start, maybe thinking about. I think Jen's been keeping up with all the text questions. If she wants to come up and ask them for Oppy or Dr. Oppy. Or if we want to go through them, then that's fine as well.
Yeah. In the meantime, the topic of causality as being fundamental is pretty interesting. Do you take a view as to whether or not that involves like the theory of time, like A theory or B theory of time?
So, on the question about A theory and B theory, I'm inclined to the view that given general relativity, probably you should lean to B theory. I think that given what I said before about perhaps time being a sort of more local phenomenon and causation a kind of broader phenomenon, I think that you can have causation without time. And so the questions about 3 versus 4-dimensionalism are not kind of that interesting for theories of causation itself.
Gotcha. Yep, I can see that. All right. Yeah, Jen, did you have any of the text questions?
Oh, nice to meet you, Dr. Oppy.
Nice to meet you too.
I've got some audience questions here from GUI. Is man perhaps more influenced by internal morality or social submission to better adapt to those around us? Some type of a notion of political correctness.
Okay, so that's a really big question. That's going to be hard to answer. So I think that it's really interesting to think about the evolution of morality and to think about what happens in small groups of people. I mean, there are reasons why you would expect that small groups that cooperated in various kinds of ways are going to be more successful than groups that don't cooperate with one another, and that a lot of the kind of principles of morality are ones that we've kind of evolved to observe. So things like not killing the members of your group and things like that. Now, there are questions about, obviously questions about how far you can spin evolutionary explanations of morality, and I'm not committing myself to kind of full reduction or anything like that. But I do think that people like Hume were kind of right when they thought that moral sentiment is something that's just kind of natural to people. It's something that can be beaten out of people, but most of us have it. And that's kind of rock bottom when you're explaining the sort of the way that morality governs human interaction. Does that answer the question enough?
I really appreciate the thoughtful response. From Darth Arianis, what are your thoughts on Bilgrami's work? Not sure if you're familiar with this.
Okay, now I'm trying to pick the particular thing. So
he went a little bit further to say he wants to know specifically if you think Bilgrami is mistaken that desires are ontologically non-reducible from physical states as a non-physicalist, and if so, why?
Okay, so the answer is I think that so I'm a kind of old-fashioned identity theorist when it comes to mental states and processes and things like that. So I think that in human beings, all mental states and processes are neural states and processes, more or less. So, of course, I think that Bilgrami's mistaken when he thinks that there's this non-identity between desires and certain kinds of neural states. There's a really, these days the identity theory is not the most popular view. There are, even amongst people who call themselves naturalists, people like Chalmers, tend to think that there's at least some kinds of mental states that are just not identifiable with physical states. The person whose work I really like on all of this is Peter Godfrey Smith, and his most recent book, which I think is out now, is one in which he is essentially saying that despite all of the disagreement over the last 40 years, no, it's longer than that now, I guess nearly 60 years, that the identity theory that Smart was running in the early 60s is more or less correct. That's my view too.
Great. This one seems a bit trickier. In Godel from James. The third degree, you briefly mention Wine's criticisms of higher order and modal logics in relation to talk of individual essences. Do you have an opinion on this?
Do I have an opinion on this? So I'm certainly not going to follow Quine in repudiating everything more or less except first order predicate calculus. I'm quite fine with higher order predicate calculus. modal logic, hence higher order modal predicate calculus, and lots of other developments in logic that you can think of as extensions of classical logic to other domains, tense logic and logic of counterfactuals and so on. Also, unlike, well, I guess in a way unlike Quine, I also am kind of open-minded about whether classical logic is the right logic. Now, I guess Quine himself thought of it as kind of an empirical question, something that was potentially revisable, but he was very keen on classical logic, and I just have an open mind about whether there might be some other logic that's the right logic, or perhaps kind of more likely still that some sort of pluralism is about logic is right, and certain logics are right in certain circumstances and other logics that are appropriate in other circumstances. But all of this goes, having said that much, this goes pretty far beyond my competence. I've taught intro logic at Monash, but not in the last 20 years, and I haven't kept up with developments in logic because that would be a full-time job. There'd be no time to do anything else. And there are other people who are much more expert at logic.
Oh, just a quick question.
Yeah,
sorry. I was just going to ask, do you consider yourself a moral anti-realist or a realist?
So I'm inclined to think of myself as a realist. So I think that I'm inclined to think that there are claims that are just true, moral claims that are true. I don't, however, I'm going to pair that with the view that you can have objectivity without objects. So I don't think there's any special moral ontology. I just think that the moral claims that are true are necessarily true, just like I think that the mathematical claims, the sort of fundamental mathematical claims that are true are necessarily true, but not because there's some Platonic realm of objects that makes those claims true. It's so if you think, for example, about some formalization of arithmetic, like piano arithmetic, then the basic, the piano axioms are just necessary truths, but it's not like there's something that makes them true. It's just that they couldn't have been otherwise. And I'm inclined to think that some moral claims are like that. That's quite a controversial view. One person whose work I like in this area, name I'm temporarily forgetting, he was a colleague of mine a few years ago, that the kind of problems for mathematical objectivity are at least as demanding as the problems for moral objectivity. And because I think that really mathematical objectivity is not too bad, I think moral objectivity is fine as well. One other thing to say in kind of support of this position, which I realise is probably not the most popular position, is that there's an awful lot of agreement about morals across human societies, and there's lots of disagreement about kind of particular cases, but there are kind of basic principles. So to take an example, you shouldn't kill. And then there's a kind of parenthetical addition, except when you're allowed to, and where there's disagreement is about some of the exceptional cases. So to take an example, some people think it's fine to kill animals for entertainment, people don't. Some people think it's fine to kill animals for food, other people don't. Most people think it's fine to kill in self-defense, and that principle applies whether you're defending yourself against people or animals, right? So it's fine. Sometimes it's fine to kill. Then there are other kind of hard cases. Is it fine to kill to terminate suffering? For most animals, we think that's fine. Some of us are less sure about that in the case of people, and so on. Right, but there's a kind of basic principle there, which is that you shouldn't kill, and I think we kind of all sign up to that. Or should.
Thank you so much. That wonderfully detailed response. We got a new question that just came in. Religions will...
can I ask one quick question real quick? I just with a lot of philosophers defining knowledge as justified true belief, what is your view on Gettier cases? Do you believe there's something wrong with that definition?
Okay. What do I think about that? So, one of my former PhD students, Brian Weatherson, has occasionally written stuff defending the claim that knowledge is justified true belief. I'm not sure that I want to line up with him, but I am kind of agnostic on this question as well. I don't think I want to go as far as the people who want to say that knowledge is just true belief. But I also don't think that anybody has really come up with a kind of satisfying theory about what the extra ingredient or ingredients are if you move beyond knowledge, truth, and understood somehow or other justification. I mean, some people might call it warrant or something else.
Yeah, I think I definitely agree with you on that, because a lot of people will like try to say that there's a luck aspect to it, but that doesn't really explain what that, like, what luck is really. So I appreciate that. Yeah.
I got a question from Gooey here. Most religions will offer a sort of heaven if one leads a, quote, moral life. Is this just proof that man only follows what will reward them? Would the more widely followed religions be nearly as popular if they didn't offer an eternally happy afterlife?
So, okay, so I mean, I guess there's several things to say here. The religions of the world are very diverse, and there are plenty of them that don't offer a kind of eternally happy afterlife. That's particularly true for some of the Eastern religions. What appealed to Schopenhauer, who was extremely kind of pessimistic and cynical, was that the kind of goal in religions like Hinduism and Buddhism is cessation of suffering and becoming non-existent. So in their view, you have a cycle of reincarnation and rebirth, and the goal is end of suffering. So you don't have eternal happiness on those views. I think for lots of indigenous religions, the goal isn't something like eternal happiness either. But it is true that for, particularly for Christianity, but also for Islam, and at least on many construals, Judaism, the promise there is of eternal happiness. Should you think that in those religions, the thing that's meant to motivate you is the prospect of the reward? That's complicated. Often the teachings, the strict teachings of the religion, or what the theologians say, is that you have to approach it a bit more indirectly than that. If you're aiming directly at the reward, you'll probably miss. What you should aim at is being good or moral, and if you hit that goal as a kind of side effect, you'll end up with the eternal happiness. And there is kind of something to be said for that kind of view, I think. And here I'm not just thinking about what religion says, but what philosophers in lots of different cultures have said as well. That if you make aiming at your own future happiness your goal, you may very well end up disappointed. Whereas if you have, and we can argue about what a better goal you should aim at, if you aim at something else, you're more likely to end up actually hitting happiness as well. So there's an answer.
Awesome. Thank you so much. All right.
Would it be okay if I asked just one question and maybe like 3 sub questions?
Yeah.
It's about the Munchausen trilemma. Hopefully, pronounce that right. I'm assuming you're familiar with this, Dr. Oppy?
Yeah, we did talk about it a little bit at the beginning as well.
But say what the trilemma is.
So, I mean, I could probably take that. So, typically, it's at the end of a chain of either explanation or, maybe it could be thought of as a causal chain or a justification chain. You will either find an unjustified, let's say, starting point or a circular starting point, or there will be no starting point and it'll just carry on forever. So I guess those are your 3 options. So it's like unjustified, circularly justified, or infinite regress.
Right, and so the thought is that you might apply this to thinking about causal reality and the question about explaining why there's a causal reality at all.
The way it's been put to me is basically because of this trilemma, it's basically a justification for why maybe knowledge is always going to be somehow lacking. The image is a guy trying to pull himself up out of a, posted it in the chat there, but it's a guy trying to pull himself out of a bog by pulling on his own ponytail. And he's sitting on a horse and he's not having much luck. So I guess I was wondering if you agreed with the basic premise. But it seems like maybe it's the first time you're hearing of it or not sure, and whether it begs the question of God. Also, whether there's any difference between circularity and self-referentiality in your opinion.
Okay, so I guess to start with, I don't think that things can explain themselves or justify themselves. That seems impossible to me. I'm actually sort of stronger than that. It seems incoherent to think that something can explain itself or justify itself because it's, what explains or justifies is prior to what gets explained. And so you end up saying that something's prior to itself, and that's just incoherent. So you can't have that kind of starting point. You can't say, well, the starting point, whatever we're talking about, is self-justified or self-evident or something like that. So what can you do? Maybe the way to go is to say that there are certain things that are perfectly appropriate as starting points, even though there's a sense in which they're not justified. So if you can trace back things to something that's necessary, you can explain why that thing holds. It holds because it's necessary, but there's never any explaining why things are necessary, according to me, right? Because what's necessary is so no matter what. So you can't give a what that it depends upon. That's just not going to be possible. So I think that it's kind of fine to have a theory in which there are certain things that you just say, well, these things are necessary, and off you go. I think that there's nothing particularly alarming about the trilemma, right? And so maybe I'm inclined to just embrace it, right, for the reason that I just gave. You can't, it's going to be true that you can't have a justification for everything that you hold unless you allow that there are circles or something like that. But there's nothing very deep, I think, here. So if we compare two people who've got different worldviews, right, when we're reckoning up who's got the better worldview, one of the things that we're going to count is how many primitives they've got in their worldview. And the primitives are, in a certain sense, the things that have no justification. And depending upon your view, your worldview may have lots and lots of primitives in it. Like, for example, I think every time you've got an indeterministic cause, you've got something primitive, because there's a bunch of things that could have happened, but only one of them did, and there's no explaining why that one did rather than all of the others. And so,
That is really well said, and I completely agree.
Yeah, and I'm actually that's one of the reasons I'm actually inclined towards that Everettian model of quantum mechanics, because it secures that it's deterministic, and it has this really like clean starting point. At least like that's what I've read from Sean Carroll again. But so I think that's what draws me to that idea. There was something else that just came up that I also wanted to ask about, though. So yeah, if you think that each time something indeterministic happens, that counts as a new primitive, would you say that that there's like some counterbalance to that on a non-naturalist view?
Well, I think that you can suppose that there's indeterminism whether you're a naturalist or a non-naturalist, and one aspect of this is that every time there's a libertarian free choice, right, there's a primitive, right, in your theory. Now, I think that the question about whether there is indeterministic causation, whether we have libertarian free choice, those questions have to be settled. And depending how they're settled, then the worldviews will, it will have them or not, right? So I'm not thinking that there's something here that's really going to be a kind of decisive choice between, say, theism and naturalism, because the best versions of those views will either be deterministic or not. They'll either have libertarian freedom or not.
Got it. I also wanted to ask about truth theory as well. Now, I don't know if you think that that's sort of another, similar to the skeptical objections, that it sort of applies to everybody and maybe it's not the most interesting thing, but do you tend to think of, I would lean towards like correspondence, like it seems to make intuitive sense to me, but a lot of times people will tell me that's kind of untenable. I don't know what you think about that.
So, I guess I don't lean towards correspondence. I would kind of rather lean towards a kind of deflationary account of truth. So I like what Quine says about truth. And he was partly following Ramsey. So lots of uses of the truth predicate just look redundant, right? If rather than say P is true, I can just say P and I say exactly the same thing. But there is a point to the truth predicate that emerges with sentences like the following one: everything the Pope says is true, right? In order to say that without using the truth predicate, you either need to have some way of displaying an infinite number of sentences, right? Because for each sentence, if the Pope says it's true, so you have to be able to quantify over propositions or something like that. So the truth predicate is there to serve a certain kind of need. It enables us to say things that otherwise we wouldn't be able to say, but it doesn't. There's no metaphysics that goes along with it. So that's kind of what I want to say. I want to have a kind of non-metaphysical view about truth. Which means I don't want to lean towards the correspondence theory. But there are problems, as is always the case in philosophy. There are problems with every view.
Definitely, and I think deflationary is definitely the other one that draws me towards it a little bit as well. And I think Gaspar probably has a question that's related to this.
Okay. Nice to meet you, Dr. Oppy.
Nice to meet you too.
Yeah, so earlier I heard you grazing over the different offshoots of logic, and you mentioned that you don't necessarily rule out a logical pluralism. Now let's grant that might be the case, that there's a situation where logical pluralism is the case, and we choose a logic according to the context, and maybe we do the same thing with theories of truth as well. So then the following question that I have for you is, this enables a lot of things, and then it also might weaken a lot of things. For example, if we suddenly have all the theories of truth available to us and all the different systems of logic, then we can have different species of realism, mathematical realism, whatever. But then it's a question of, if we have available to us mathematical realism by one logic and one argument, and then non-realism by another argument, is the realism in name only? So to sum up my question, if logical pluralism is the case, what is its effect, in your view, on the legitimacy of specifically realist philosophy?
Right. So I was thinking that there's a kind of context sensitivity here, so that for some contexts or some subject matters, one logic is appropriate, and for other contexts or other subject matters, another logic is appropriate. Maybe if religious pluralism, or not religious, if logical pluralism is right. I was thinking that, for example, when it comes to mathematics, or maybe you have to make it kind of a bit finer than that, so arithmetic or algebra or whatever, there's just one logic that applies in each case. So the pluralism doesn't threaten the kind of case that you're worrying about. So is that enough of an answer? Or?
Yeah, I believe so. So you're saying in specific cases, like with arithmetic, there are certain logics that are sufficient, while maybe elsewhere in philosophy at large, it might be a little bit more
right.
Open.
So
right.
here's maybe to illustrate this. I'm going to turn this off. It might be that classical logic is just right for arithmetic, but there's a certain part of the theory of databases where some sort of paraconsistent logic is the right logic to have, right? And that doesn't threaten truth in either domain. I mean, maybe this, right? It doesn't. There's no threat of difficulty, I think, if it's divided up in that kind of way.
Okay, I see. Then maybe if it's all right, I'll follow it up with one more question. With if there is this context-based logical pluralism that you illustrate here, since logic is at least an attempt to be neutral to subject matter, do you feel like all the other branches of philosophy inherit this degree of plurality from logic?
So I'm not sure. So how to answer that? So I don't see why you would think, if the kind of logic was tied to subject matter, unless you're thinking, for example, that, there's philosophy of mathematics and there's philosophy of knowledge and philosophy of mind and so on. And so we're going to end up with different logics that apply in the different areas of philosophy because there's different logics that apply to the underlying domains, something like that. Maybe I haven't quite followed your question.
Okay, sorry. Maybe I'll reword it. Again, if we have at our disposal whatever theory of truth we want, and we have at our disposal whatever logic we want, and we just need to make sure to use it in the right context, then does this plurality, or maybe we'll call it instrumentalism or pragmatism, is this automatically inherited in all the other branches of philosophy? Because, like, for example, let's say, no, metaphysics is a different conversation. Well, eventually, after you've come up with some metaphysical theory, surely you're going to turn around and try to make a sound argument with it. And then you're going to have to make the decision of whether you're a logical pluralist or not. And if you're a logical pluralist, then it will probably affect your metaphysics and your ethics and everything else. That's I'm asking if you think that is the consequence.
So I was thinking, but you might just think, well, look, there's one logic that applies to metaphysics, and maybe there's a different logic that applies to ethics. So it wasn't clear to me that the consequence was going to be the way that you wanted to go.
I see. Yeah, so you would say that there might be logics better suited to metaphysics and ethics and things like that.
Yeah. So possibly. I mean, we've gone way beyond what I'm competent to talk about here. A guy that was at the University of Melbourne for years, but he's now moved to St Andrews, Greg Restall, would be a much better person to talk to about logical pluralism than me.
I see. Well, thanks for giving us your view on that.
So I was actually having a discussion recently with some people. I'm wondering, Dr. Oppy, do you think that there is a difference between metaphysical possibility and logical possibility, or do you kind of view them in the same way?
So there's a notion of kind of formal logical possibility. Consider the claim that 1 and 1 are 2. That's not a formal logical necessity, right? It's not. I mean, if we're thinking about the form, let's follow Quine and say that the right logic is first order predicate calculus. Then it's not a theorem it's not an instance of a theorem of logic that 1 and 1 and 2. So in that sense, there's a kind of distinctive notion of logical possibility. It's kind of purely formal. It's relative to a choice of logic because, for example, if necessarily P, then P is not a truth. It's not an instance of a theorem of first order predicate calculus, but it is if you take some sufficiently strong modal logic. It then just comes out as a formal truth. There's a different sense of necessity from that one, that formal one, which I, at any rate, I think that there's another notion that I want to distinguish from that one. The kind of thing that Kripke is talking about when he's talking about it being necessary that water is H2O. And that is the kind of example that I would give of a kind of metaphysical necessity. I don't think of that as in any sense formal. So, yeah, in that sense, I want to distinguish between the two. But there are other people who distinguish between what I was just calling logical necessity, logical modality, they call narrow logical modality, and then they think that there's this kind of broad logical modality, and they think of that as being something distinct from metaphysical modality, and I'm not at all sure that there's another distinction.
Okay. All right. I think we have a few more text questions.
Hello.
You there, Jen?
Yeah, so am I coming through okay?
Yeah.
Yep.
Thanks. I was wondering your thoughts on everything happening or having a cause. For example, person dying at a certain time for unknown reasons or suddenly. you do believe in this, how can you support the idea? If you don't believe in this, why don't you believe in the idea? Do you have anything to support that as well?
Okay, so we've talked a little bit already about indeterminism. I think that there's nothing that happens that has no cause. It's just that there are some things that happen that have necessary causes but not sufficient causes, if I can put it like that. So when you've got a kind of indeterministic cause, the prior state determines the range of possibilities, and so that's the extent of the causing that gets done, but it doesn't select out the particular thing that happens. If there's no indeterminism, right, so we're supposing no quantum indeterminacy, no libertarian freedom or anything like that, so that the world's a deterministic system, then if there's anything that has no cause, it will only be whatever there is in the initial state, assuming that there's an initial state. If you think that there's infinite regress and you think that the world's deterministic, then, and I think this is the only way it can happen, leaving aside possibilities of circular causes, then it will turn out that everything has a cause. That is, every particular event will have a cause. That's sufficient for it. I've already suggested that I'm kind of sympathetic to the view that causation is indeterministic, and I've also suggested that I'm sympathetic to the view, though I'm not going to endorse it, that there's an initial state. If there's an initial state, if there's a beginning, then there are things that don't have a cause. Everything else, according to me, has a cause. I think that answers your question.
Thank you so much. I was just wondering real quick, are you aware of a difference in definitions between circularity and self-referentiality? This is just kind of for me. Sorry to slip it in again. You're just so fascinating. I've got a background in math and physics, so it's a bit confusing to come over to the philosophy side. I'm trying to trap you, but just wondering if you're aware of any difference between circularity and self-referentiality. Thanks.
So I'm thinking of if you allow that there can be circles, then you're going to allow, in the sense that I was just talking, that there can be self-explanation, I think, because if A explains B, B explains C, C explains A, unless we deny transitivity, we're going to end up with A explains A, right? So there's a connection between circularity and self-explanation. My argument that you couldn't have self-explanation was also an argument against circularity as well, the way that I was thinking about it, because I was taking transitivity for granted. You might think that you shouldn't do that, that you should think, well, you know, a kind of one circle, a thing that just directly explains itself, we'll rule that out. But a really big circle might be okay. And then we'll just distinguish between kind of direct and indirect causation, something where there's a whole lot of steps in between versus one where there's no steps in between. And maybe in that way you can make out a distinction between self-explanation and circularity. But you're quite right. I've been jumping over stuff, especially about the significance of assumptions about transitivity in what I've been saying.
I really appreciate it. I mean, if nothing else, it highlights the complexity of the problem, so I do appreciate that. We have a question from Darth Arianis. What your view is on Quine's commitment to the claim that all logics are rationally revisable in some manner. Whether you agree with Quinian revisability.
Okay, so I guess I'm not inclined to, I don't know, our opinions. So suppose you're a pluralist, then you might think that our opinions about what's the right logic in particular circumstances is going to be revisable. It's not that the logic's revisable, but our opinion about what's the appropriate logic might be. And the example I gave before, there are people who argue that in order to have a really good theory about databases, in order to be able to deal with inconsistencies in databases, you need to have a non-classical paraconsistent logic to apply to that. And people who are friends of kind of paraconsistent logic think there's all kinds of cases where classical logic is just not the right logic to use. And so opinion might have been revised at some point. People thought that classical logic would do fine, and then they decided that it wasn't. I guess that's what Quine means by the revisability of logic. It's a revisability about what's the right logic, revisability of opinion about what's the right logic.
Thank you so much. King Rascal, first of his name, would like to know your opinion on existentialism.
So I don't have much of an opinion about existentialism. I read as an undergraduate, I read stuff by Camus and Sartre, and I've never kind of really gone back and thought about it very much since. That would be an honest answer. It's not something that's figured very highly in my philosophical priorities. There's always this kind of there's this thing. I'm not going to start making confessions, but you can only read a tiny amount of the philosophy that's out there, and you can only think about a tiny amount of the philosophy that's out there. So every philosopher, there are these kind of great big domains where you just don't have an informed view at all, and this is one of mine.
There was a question, I don't see it anymore, but it was perhaps whether there was some way to go between logic systems to see which one is most justified. And if that's too abstract, the question I would place in its stead is, how does science justify itself? Like, what's the difference? There's that much uncertainty. What's the deciding factor that justifies science as having the authority we accord it?
So I'm inclined to approach this from a different perspective, from a kind of social epistemology perspective. The thing that we have with science is expert consensus on claims and methods. Now, that is, there's a bunch of stuff that we just think is settled, that we know in the sciences. And that opinion is shared by all the people who are qualified to judge. So if I give you a problem in classical mechanics, and we take it round and we ask all of the physicists, what's the answer to this problem? Kind of well-established, in a well-established, kind of well-worked-out part of classical mechanics, they're all going to give the same answer. And it's in a way, it's kind of that gives science its authority. Right? Physics is just the same in Pakistan or Nicaragua or Australia or the United States, and it just gives the same answers. Of course, around the core of stuff that's settled in any science, there's stuff that's currently being investigated, and physicists or chemists or whoever we're talking about have opinions, right? And so you don't have consensus, and if you're not part of the community, it's probably best for you just to suspend judgment about those questions, right? So, for example, take string theory, whether you should, as a kind of non-physicist, what should you think about that? Well, given that the physicists haven't made up their minds about it, you should probably just suspend your judgment. So if you think of science as an institution, the goal of science is it's a kind of regulative ideal. What we're aiming for is expert consensus, and we get it by and large. Sometimes it takes a long time to settle certain issues, so things can go on being debated for a long time before expert consensus settles down. And it's also the case that as you kind of move further out in any discipline towards the kind of periphery, you shade into an area where it's not just that there's no agreement on claims and there's no agreement on what will be the methods that would potentially settle those claims. You kind of get into philosophy of that discipline. So I think that every discipline, this is where the philosophy of the discipline comes in. It's once you get to that sort of area where we know that there's no expert agreement on claims, but we also know there's no expert agreement on methods, where there's dispute even about whether we're still in the discipline at all. And in fact, my previous example about string theory probably sits better there, because there are some physicists who think that string theory is the future, and there are others who think that it's forever untestable and it's not really part of physics at all. Right, so
Thank you very much.
Yeah, okay.
So
we did have another question from the audience. Did you want to take it away?
Yeah, I'll read this one. So it's from the aptly named brutefacts.com. And he's asking about if you have any opinion on Pruss and Kuhn's most recent paper where they talk about the PSR being required for empirical knowledge.
Right. So one thing that one place where I disagree with Pruss, and I guess now that Kuhn's was kind of saying similar kinds of things with Kuhn's as well, what I said earlier about what happens where you've got indeterminism. According to me, wherever you've got indeterminism, you've got brute facts, right? There's no explaining why this particular process issued in A rather than B, given that it was not determined that you get A, that you get B. And so I think that the kind of argument that they're running assumes to the contrary, I think, that those are not brute facts. So that's one point of difference between Pruss and Kuhn's and me. I haven't, so it's a while since I looked at this. So I don't think that that's the only point of disagreement that I have with them, but that's a kind of important point of disagreement.
All right. I have a question about another argument that's I think it's used in their paper, or it's referenced in their most recent paper, but it's Josh Rasmussen's argument about it uses Cantor's theorem to kind of show that there's more mental facts than physical facts. It seems odd to me. I'm not sure if you've seen that one.
Well, so I've seen it, and in fact, it's quite a long time ago that I saw it, because Josh sent me a version of that argument very early on, or drew my attention to it very early on. So I don't remember off the top of my head why I think that argument doesn't work, but I don't think that the argument works. I guess it would be sort of odd from a naturalist perspective, that there could be a Cantorian argument that would establish this, given that I think that all of the mental facts are just some amongst the natural facts. Because I'm an identity theorist, and I think that, pick any claim that's purporting to state a natural fact, that's just going to be a mental fact, that's just going to be identical to some particular natural fact. And then there's a whole lot of natural facts that have nothing to do with the mental. So obviously there's a straightforward argument that there's way more physical facts, say, than there are mental facts.
Yeah, that's the way I look at it as well. So yeah, I'm glad that I wasn't the only one. All right, I'm not sure if anybody in the audience wants to come up at this point. Feel free to raise your hand if anybody wants to ask a question on voice. Otherwise, we can see if we get any more in the chat, and then if we don't see any more, we can probably close it out. I know we're coming up on the end of your time, right?
Yeah, that's right. I have to go and do something else at 12:30. So, in fact, I mean, it's very important engagement. I have to go and have lunch with someone, but I have to go.
Okay, well, we really appreciate you coming here. It's been great. I think everybody's learned a lot. I hope we can do it again sometime. And again, thank you so much for doing this. It's been really enlightening, and yeah, we really appreciate it.